Together wrong that I should say anything nice about Don Hunstein. What I should do that I think would be altogether right is show you pictures by Don Hunstein. Because sometimes I think people, when they say Glenn Gould was such a recluse, they forget that Glenn Gould had, I think, a sort of love affair with the camera. And all of us have scores of images of Glenn Gould that came through the camera, and in particular through the camera of Don Hunstein. In fact, one of the great things for a wonderful evening, if you can do it, and I'm now proud to call Deanne and Don my friends. They're really, I think, of all the people I've met who were in Glenn's world, apart from the Toronto mafia here, I think Don and Deanne have become my best friends in the Gould world. But the best thing is just to have dinner with Deanne and Don and hear Don speak, and you really have to pump him to get him to say this, but to hear him speak about the world of artists, not just Glenn Gould, but all the artists whom he has photographed and whom we all have, whether on CD covers or album covers or in books, in our home. And I know a lot of us have a dream of seeing someday, and we want to accomplish it, the photographs of Don Hunstein collected and presented in book form that will be available to the world. So we haven't accomplished that yet, but then we need something to work on in the future, and that's one of the projects I would like to see us particularly work on. Well, I've spoken about Don Hunstein. As I say, what I really ought to do is hold up images that represent one of the most important links, a human link, between Glenn Gould and us. And it was the camera, and it was the camera of this particular man. So often, one of the most oft-asked questions from around the world that I get is Don Hunstein the photographer in that video that we now have from the National Film Board, On and Off the Record? You know the National Film Board of Canada? Who's that young, good-looking guy that's in there taking photographs? He is Don Hunstein. Mr. Hunstein. Well,
people ask me about that film about once a week. It seems to be shown on public television quite a lot in the New York area. Happens all the time. There's one little bit of dialogue I am reminded, although I don't remember it, it's been a long time, in which I am asked, I think by the director, to sort of hover around the piano and ask Glenn if it's okay if I take some pictures. And he responds, "Must we?" And what's interesting about that is that Glenn never, ever said anything like that to me in life, in all the time that we worked together. The thing about the book, John, is that there are some, I've been through this many times with people. People ask me about that about once a week too. There are some legal problems with the Sony, formerly CBS, CBS Columbia and so on. They own that stuff. I don't. Had I been a freelance, I would own it. And therefore, they put conditions on publishing a book, the main one being that I would be responsible for getting clearances from all the subjects or their heirs or estates to publish specific pictures. And they would have to see the specific pictures, all that sort of thing. I'm told book publishers would put people on the case and do it for me if there were a publisher. But the publisher can't be got until some other things. Anyway, it gets very complicated. And it comes up all the time. And yeah, I think about it, sure. Bruno said yesterday that he wanted to consider this a kind of a chat, which is exactly the way I feel about it. It's not going to be very sequential. Things will come up in my mind here, and I've got some of the LP covers that do relate to anecdotes or stories or just interesting sidelights about the conditions under which the pictures were taken. In June '55, Glenn was making the first Goldberg record. I was working at that time as an assistant to a New York photographer named Gene Cook. And Gene had just recently left Life magazine, where he was entertainment editor, to become a full-time photographer. He had been doing photography on the side. And he established himself, and he hired me through a series of circumstances to be his assistant. When he became a professional photographer, one of his clients was a woman that he had dealt with in his role as editor. Was the publicity director for Columbia Records, a woman called Debbie Ishline. And Debbie then, the roles got kind of reversed, and she hired Gene to do some shooting of artists for her. And one of my jobs, it wasn't really a job, it was just a regular task to, as his employee, was to visit Columbia and take proof sheets, contact sheets, to the publicity department, to the woman in question, Debbie Ishline, and act as a kind of liaison. They got to know me, therefore, and knew that I did a little photography on my own. One day she said to me, this business is expanding very quickly. This is late 1955, I guess. This business is expanding very quickly, and this department, which is only 3 people, can't handle the photo thing along with all our other duties. Would you be interested in coming to work for us? To edit pictures and to make sure that magazines and newspapers were supplied with what they needed. And I thought about that in about 2 seconds and said, sure. A gentleman just asked me this morning about how I came to be connected with Glenn, and that's how it happened. It's something I fell into. I didn't seek the job, I was offered it and I took it. And, but I think she suspected also that I could maybe be trusted to do some photography as well as just handle publicity involved in disseminating photographs. And little by little, I was asked by her and other people in the company to shoot this or shoot that, and went down to recording sessions, almost all of them in those days in a legendary studio on 30th Street in New York, called the 30th Street Studio, and where Glenn did all but I think one of his records. That one being the Stokowski Beethoven Fifth, which was recorded at a place called Manhattan Center on West 34th Street, where they needed a bigger place for a full orchestra. 30th Street wouldn't quite give them the sound they wanted. In any case, I got more and more involved at their request in shooting, and one thing led to another. I didn't meet Glenn. That was in, I started at Columbia in January of '56, and it was over a year before I met him. That was in April of '57, and it involved a rather, what I call a kind of, in a certain way, a typical Glenn situation. He was about to make his first recording with Bernstein in the Philharmonic. It's Beethoven. I don't remember which one. And whether he asked Columbia or Steinway, I don't know. It doesn't matter. 4 full-size pianos, full grands, were delivered to the 30th Street studio, 4 of them. About a week, I think it was, ahead of that recording session. He wanted to make sure of the sound of the piano in that studio, in that context, instead of, let's say, going to the Steinway basement on 57th Street, which a lot of pianists did for concerts, and pick one there. And I guess he was afraid that it wouldn't sound the same in 30th Street studio, which was an old converted church with a terrific acoustic, famous place, gone now. And so Debbie asked me to go down to the studio with him and take pictures of him doing this. And they had the 4 pianos lined up in a row, and he went from one to another. He took his famous chair and played here, and then he'd go back, and so on and so on. I spent the whole afternoon. I got up on a ladder, and For those of you who are going to Stratford today, I think that picture is one of them, John, where I got up on a rather high ladder and could see the whole thing. And he's at the piano at the far end of the row. Behind him, he's got his electric heater. That was the first time that I think that I met him at all, and it was certainly the first session, photo session. I think it wasn't until a very similar situation, exactly 1 year later, in April of '58, that, and I think it was for the same reason. He wanted to choose a piano for, I think, the first of the Vladimir Golshman Bach concerti. He did 3, and 2 with Golshman's, 1 with somebody else. But I think what he wanted to do was make sure that the piano was suited to what he was going to do. So again, I went with him. We went out to the Steinway factory in Queens, and for a full afternoon, we walked around with Fritz Steinway, who was then heading the company, and 2 of his best technicians, one of whom had a clipboard, and again, Glenn had his piano, the chair with the filigree back and the adjustable legs. And he went from one piano, and then Fritz would say, or one of the technicians would suggest this piano, and they'd go there. This went on all afternoon. I don't remember, I guess he picked one there too. Anyway, in any case, the recording session with Golshman took place also at 30th Street very soon thereafter that. There is one particular picture that's in the Stratford show from that visit to the factory, and that is not in there with the pianos, but when Glenn was waiting, or we were waiting for a taxi to go back to Manhattan, he slouched down in a chair. He was a great sloucher, you know, and draped his legs over the arm of the chair, sat kind of sideways, and he looks very young in that picture, although of course he was by then, what, 24, I think. He looks like 15 or 16. And his socks are kind of falling down, and but so those were the first 2 times. I, at that point, had very little or no photo studio and lighting experience. And for much of the first, I don't know, several years into the 60s, mostly what I did was cover the recording sessions, mostly, and mostly in black and white. In those days, color was not the everyday standard thing that it is now. And you can see, as you go back through his pictures and everybody else's, the progression to increasing use of color. And but I'm going to go back a minute. When we were here 7 years ago, Kevin Wood, who was then on the staff of Sony Records, Sony Classical in Hamburg, asked me to write a few words for one of their CD reissues of Glenn, and I did. And I want to just read a little piece of this, and this refers to what John said about Glenn and the camera. Glenn Gould made my job easy. He and I first worked together in April 1957 when he was 24. I was 4 years older than he is, which means that there he was, and means that if he were 66 today, I'd be 70, which I am. And from the start, it was clear that he had a talent for the camera. Not only did he not fear or distrust it, he welcomed it. And I think that anybody who worked with him, it was an obvious thing. There's a book, there are 2 photographers that work for the newspapers here. If you see their stuff, one guy called, I never met him, they're both dead now, I think, Herb Knott and Jock Carroll. Jock Carroll was sent by the Star, I think he worked for the Star, on an extraordinary 2-week trip to the Bahamas, of all places, with Glenn, who I guess had some date there. I don't know why. I think it was that long, somebody told me, or it's in the book. It's a charming little book. John, do you know it? Jock Carroll's book? Am I correct about that? The astonishing thing is to see Glenn, relevant to what you said today about the rain and all that, which is true. See Glenn's sitting out on a beach in full sunlight, Didn't have his overcoat, but he had a jacket and trousers on. I'm sure he never took those off. And also, in the book, as I recall, there's a little game being played. They made an amateur theatrical or something, and Carol took a picture of all of this activity. There's not much of it, but it's something that just is quite unexpected if you know about Glenn. Let me skip around here a little bit. The first time I came to Toronto was with Debbie Echelon, the lady that I worked for. And I believe that the object was to try to get a cover picture for an album. I had never done one. And Glenn, well, we couldn't go to his place. That just wasn't done, really. He liked to meet us someplace, and he suggested a small, what I call a family kind of hotel, a place called the Windsor Arms, where we could meet. And I had a camera and a tripod, and I think maybe only one light of some kind. And we met there. And there was really no place to work except the lobby of the hotel and a little room off the lobby. And we managed. I remember recently looking in the files at Sony, and we did about 10 rolls of film in there. Him sitting and doing taking various attitudes. And this is I think this is in the exhibit out there. This is the picture that was chosen from that day. Of course, the blue is not in the original photograph, but and it's very characteristic of it. It turns out, as I found out over the years, that this was a very characteristic pose of Glenn's. When you get in front of the camera, and in fact, there are several others in here. I don't have all the LP covers, by the way. For some reason, some of them are missing in my collection. But he would, one of the things that he would almost invariably do, and I would sometimes have to say, please don't do that again, is he would do this, or this. And it was just, and he did it there. And he's also has this little impish grin. I don't know but I think that's characteristic, because we had a good time together. And from that first time when he was testing out the pianos, I don't think there was ever a tense moment. I mean, he accepted me immediately. There was never a question about that quoted in the film. Must we? He never said anything like that. It raised the question in my mind. I don't know how graphically oriented he was. He never, with one instance, which I'll tell you about in a minute, he never questioned what I did or suggested to him. He just left it up to me. I asked Ray Roberts, is over here, this morning, if he knew whether Glenn had contractual approval of his covers. And Ray says he did. That wasn't always the case with artists, I don't think. What really caused that to be a general thing now in all artist contracts was the power of rock and roll groups. They really started to exercise their muscle because they were big money makers, of course. But that wasn't until the late 60s and into the 70s. But he never, so I don't know whether, and I guess he did, the art department would send him a mock-up of some kind of a proposed cover for a specific record, and I guess he approved them as we see them today. But the other thing that was curious about, as I look back on it, in that production of covers situation, was that usually when packaging is considered in the company, there are some kinds of meetings. There's a product manager, usually a person in marketing whose responsibility is to handle certain artists in all aspects, one of which is packaging. And there's an art director assigned to a particular thing, and usually there's some kind of meeting, either with an illustrator or a photographer or whatever, and if the artist is around, maybe with the artist too. But I can't remember being in any such meeting in the case of Glenn, although we did a lot of covers of other people. We had a studio next to the CBS building for many years. They would just, I don't know why, but it happened that they would just say, well, get together with Gould and work something out, that kind of thing, you know. So I'd call him if it were a case of my coming up here, particularly. And as you know, you never got him on the phone, but he would call back and later sometime, and we'd talk about things a little bit. But it was just, we kind of did it by the seat of our pants. And there's one... well, let me do a little, see if there's anything chronologically first before I jump ahead here. That was done in what's the place, the name of the place, Ray, John? Casaloma, a house, I don't even know where it is, I think. These two pictures were done on the same day, that one you may remember. This is, a lot of people tell me that that's their favorite picture of him. Trying to find the, I am jumping around. Those were back in the early 60s. This was 1970. But I remember saying to him on the phone from New York, let's not do it indoors anywhere. Let's go out someplace, can we? Well, it happened to be January. There was 6 inches of snow on the ground, but of course that suited him just fine. He couldn't.
Don, you can't see the pictures over.
Oh, I'm sorry. You remember those? Oh, I'm sorry. Right. So when I got up here, I said, well, he said, well, let's just get in the car and go out someplace or whatever. I mean, it was really seat-of-the-pants stuff, but we got out into this area, I don't know how far out of town, maybe 20 miles or so, and I said, let's just go out and walk around, and that's what we did. I used that as an example in these few notes for Kevin Wood of a case where if people say, well, how do you decide what you're going to do? I mean, you listen to the music, and does that tell you something? And I don't know if anybody does it any other way, but no, there's no connection. You know, as far as I know, you just go and try to get something characteristic of the artist and something that is eye-catching to the consumer or whatever, but so that people look at the thing and get some sense of the person or whatever. That's all, and that's really all you can do. You can't, and that's all we did. You know. By the way, we I don't know which of us started it. We always referred to this as the Dr. Zhivago picture because the movie had just come out and it reminded us, I don't know, it looked Russian, I guess, all that snow and everything, you know. And we never referred to it any other way. And then somebody, maybe it was you, Ray, who, I don't remember, who said that was possibly his favorite picture of himself. Did you tell me that? No? I don't know. Somebody did. Anyway, back to the very first one. The interesting point about the location, the little hotel where we did that first cover picture, is that it was, I think for Glenn, the reason he knew it is because it was the kind of place that was for him the essentially old Toronto. It was this kind of slightly Gothic, very quiet family place. No bars. I don't think there was a bar in the place. In fact, in Toronto in those days, that wasn't a surprise. If anybody, it's interesting to see the change in all these years because it was really a blue town, you know, and nothing was open on Sunday and so on and so forth. But that was Glenn. Glenn liked it that way, I think, and he, as we all know, he regretted what happened in later years, what some of us liked so much, and that it became a cosmopolitan world city, whereas it really kind of wasn't. It was big, but it wasn't. But it was kind of insular, you know. That was him, though. Yesterday, Deanna and I made a point, because he's heard about this before, made a point of going to the Windsor Arms. It still exists. But oh boy, has it changed. It is an exact metaphor of what has happened to Toronto and the thing that Glenn didn't like, in that it's got not one but two very spiffy bars and a four-star restaurant. And I tried to find the corner of the lobby or whatever where we did that picture. I'm fairly sure that I found it, but that's about the only thing that you would recognize from 35, 40 years ago. All right. The other outdoor situation similar to that occurred, this was 1970, it was in 74. I must have been here for several days because we did 2 or 3 different things. One of them produced a picture that they used on the cover of the English Suites. And there again, it's his characteristic pose. In this case, he's leaning back, not forward. And we did it at the apartment of Mario Pritzek, who was his producer at CBC Television at the time, I think. And Mario said, just if you want a place to, just go up there and do whatever you want. And so I sat Glenn down in a chair, and that picture came out of it. Going back, incidentally, let me go backtrack to the question of who plans or doesn't plan, or who consults about what goes on an LP cover or CD cover now. The sort of a corollary to that, in a sense, is who makes the decision of which picture to use after the pictures are taken. Aside from the approval by the artist, the first thing that has to happen is the design director or the art director and the product manager and all those same people involved take a look and decide, well, we think this is best or whatever. But rarely, probably never, does the photographer, or at least in my experience, is no longer a part of the process. So it leads, as you can imagine, to some dissatisfaction occasionally when they decide to use a picture that you don't think is the best in the set. I'll show you an example of that. It's the Jamie Laredo cover. See it over there? This was done in a CBC studio. They'd been rehearsing. I don't think it was a recording session, but they'd been rehearsing for the pieces they did together, the violin sonatas. And we were in a small control room, and this, to my mind, is a pretty boring picture. What I was hoping they would use is one where we rearranged some recording equipment, and I had Glenn and Jamie leaning over the meter board of a mixing board, the meter panel, and so you saw some of the technology there, and then we put some tape machines behind them, which I thought was pretty appropriate to Glenn, but they didn't use it. So that's just a little sidelight as to the process of producing these things. What I started to say about the snow picture and a sort of a sequel to that, in 74, with a 2-day trip, which involved going to Mario's apartment, and then we went out, I think, on the next day. Back out again. It was April, though, and the snow was half melted, and so we went back. May have been on the grounds of the same place. Does it have a large area, the Kazaluma? Yeah. There's a lake there? No, well, someplace else. Anyway, Glenn took us directly there. He wanted to go there. And one of the pictures from that day is the one that forms the basis for the sculpture, where there's a bench that looks out over the lake. Now, as you look at that sculpture, the lake was to our right, and I had some pictures of him turned around, and I looked at him almost from the back, 3/4 from the back, so that you saw the lake and this melting snow and some pine trees and all that. And in the Stratford show, there are, I think, 2 pictures from that set, that one, but also a close-up which has been used a lot by Sony publicity. It's with him with the cap and the gloves and the whole thing. It's very, very close up. And one of us, again, I think I said to him, are you ever planning to make a record of the music of Sibelius? Because this is the picture. It looks like Finland to me here. So we called that the Sibelius set of pictures. He did make a record. It was issued 3 years later in 1977. But there again, I mean, speaking of not seeing eye to eye about what to use, or from the photographer's point of view, they did not use anything from that set in the LP package. They had an artist do a collage of some snow-capped mountains, and I don't know, are there snow-capped mountains in Finland? There are. Okay. And a picture of Sibelius and a couple of other things, a kind of a collage. As far as I know, in fact, I'm sure that those pictures, which again were among my favorites, were never used in an LP package, but they've been used a lot for publicity, and of course, as I say, they've been used to do the bench. Yes, John.
Well, I made a mistake. Because when I first asked Don if he would come, he said, I'm really nervous about speaking, and I can't speak for very long. So, half an hour. And I think he's got more to say, but my problem is that with the buses and so on this afternoon and how he set it up, the other presentation begins at 1:30. So I'm just a bit concerned about the time, although I know you want to ask questions, and this man can go on longer.
I do. Yes, I do.
We should wind it up, and
okay.
Folks can ask you questions
all right.
later on the bus and in Stratford, because Don's coming to Stratford with us.
Well, okay, because I could give you background on a couple of other interesting situations. One with Leonard Rose, and where Deanne was present, and Glenn played a private concert for us after Leonard. It was a rehearsal. It's at a CBC studio, and he played a private concert because she was there, I think, not because of me. But stuff like that. But yes, many of these are related to those pictures out there. So if you want to leave it, and I'm going to be there, so we can talk out there. Is that okay?
Yes.
All right.
I believed you, and
I did too.
Yeah.
I believe.
I think we'll talk with Don on the bus, and Don will be there to take us around. It's tough to take 140 people around, but we'll be around to see the show.